What's up, everybody? Welcome to the 40/40 Vision podcast, the ultimate sports history podcast where hindsight is 40/40. I'm your host, Khaled Abdallah, and I'm joined today by my fellow host, Sulman Haque. What's up, man? How are you?
Yo, what's going on, man?
Not much. So, today we're covering the three biggest what-ifs in the career of soon-to-be former Raiders franchise quarterback Derek Carr. The Raiders will be trading or releasing Carr sometime in the next few weeks, and we're recording this podcast on February 3rd, so sometime probably in the next 10 days before the Super Bowl. And as a lifelong Raiders fan and a big fan of Derek Carr himself, I wanted to do an episode on what I thought were the biggest what-ifs of his career. So Sulman isn't a Raiders fan, but he's joining me on this slightly self-indulgent episode, so let's jump right in. The first what-if that we're going to talk about is in regards to where Derek Carr was drafted. So he was drafted 36th overall in the 2014 draft by, of course, the then Oakland Raiders. And there were three quarterbacks that were taken ahead of him in the first round or the early second round in the case of the Minnesota Vikings selection. So the three quarterbacks picked ahead of him were Blake Bortles, taken by the Jacksonville Jaguars, Johnny Manziel, Johnny Football, taken by the Cleveland Browns, and Teddy Bridgewater, who was drafted by the Minnesota Vikings. So the question, or the what if here in this case, is what if Derek Carr was drafted by any of those three teams? So before we jump into that, do you agree with me that he is a better quarterback than the three guys I listed
100%.
ahead of him?
Yes, 100%. Okay. Yeah, it's not even close.
It is indeed not even close. So the first situation we'll look at is what if he ended up on the Jacksonville Jaguars? So they picked Blake Bortles third or fourth overall, which was kind of a curious selection. I know he looked pretty good at UCF, but it seemed like a bit of a stretch. But anyway, for the most part, Blake Bortles struggled in Jacksonville, but they had one really good season in 2017 where they had the fifth-ranked offense and the second-ranked defense in the NFL. Do you remember that season? They beat, I believe it was Pittsburgh, at Pittsburgh in the playoffs, and then they went on to lose, I believe, in was it the conference championship game? Whatever it was, they lost to the New England Patriots, but it was much closer than you would have thought with a team led by Blake Bortles. So what do you think happens if Carr ends up in Jacksonville? Is he still the quarterback there?
It's possible. Derek Carr, right? Like, he came in, he started his rookie season with the Raiders. If he does that on the Jaguars, I think Blake Bortles came in and started his rookie season too. So I think Derek Carr would have the same success here on the Jaguars. And as they start adding weapons, like when we get to 2017, Derek Carr's rolling by then, and he's probably, that Jaguars team might even be a Super Bowl contender with him at the helm. That's what I think.
I think that's fair to say because, like I said, they had the fifth-ranked offense. They had solid weapons around him. They had Leonard Fournette, Alan Hearn, so he had some weapons. And then the defense, of course, was elite. They had guys like Jalen Ramsey, Miles Jack. So they had a really good unit there, and they were, of course, hamstrung by the quarterback position, and that's why they eventually ended up losing to the Patriots in that season. And then, a couple years later, they go back to the toilet. Blake Bortles is gone, and now he's no longer in the NFL. So I think it's fair to say that Derek Carr in that situation probably succeeds because if Blake Bortles could do it for one season, then I'm sure Derek Carr could do it for several. The 100%. Second one is an absolute nightmare of a what if for Carr, and that's what happens if he ends up on the Cleveland Browns. So the Cleveland Browns, they kind of reach, we can say, for Johnny Manziel. We find out later that he had a lot of personal issues. He had some drug issues that led to his epic flameout in the NFL. But this is an organization that won 4 games over 3 years, including an 0-16 season in 2017. And I think it's fair to say that they've improved as an organization since. They've built a really good team. They've just been a quarterback short. But this particular time in Brown's history, I think it's pretty clear that if he ended up there, he's probably not spending 9 years there like he did in with the Raiders.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. He's definitely not staying in Cleveland long term. He's probably on the move after 2-3 years. He's not signing an extension there. But what is interesting is in 2014, he would have been paired up there with Kyle Shanahan. So that could have been a pretty interesting season for Derek Carr and for the Browns there at that point. But other than that, there's nothing more interesting going on there with him if he ends up in Cleveland. Like, I think, within 2-3 years, he's out of there. He's finding his next team in free agency.
For sure. He's not surviving 10 years under, or 4 years total under Mike Pettin and Hugh Jackson, which would have been an ironic little twist. Of course, Hugh Jackson was the head coach of the Raiders. But the Kyle Shanahan thing is interesting because whatever you may say about Kyle Shanahan's in-game decision-making and things like that, one thing he's really known for is making life easy for a quarterback and making the game easy for a quarterback. So, I mean, maybe Carr and Shanahan will link up in San Francisco this time next year. We'll see. I doubt it. I don't know what the odds are.
No
there,
comment.
but...
No comment. It's pretty low odds, though, I would say.
Yeah. So the third team, and I think that's the by far the best situation for him from this draft, at least for the teams that wanted a quarterback, would have been if he was drafted by the Minnesota Vikings. So Teddy Bridgewater, he starts right away. He leads the Vikings to the playoffs his second season and looks the part of a possible franchise quarterback before he blows out his knee in training camp. And I think it was a devastating knee injury. And it was to the point where I remember reading about it where it said if he had fallen a certain way or if they hadn't gotten to him straight away, he was at risk of losing the bottom half of his leg after that injury. So, and it was non-contact. His knee just kind of exploded. It was really crazy. But anyway, he's still in the league, so good for him. So after that injury, the Vikings trade a first-round pick for Sam Bradford. He stinks. They play Case Keenum. They make it to the NFC Championship game with him, and then, of course, they're stuck right now with Kirk Cousins. But they've been one of the better teams in the league over the past 9 years, regardless of who was playing quarterback for them. And I think it's pretty easy to see a situation where you swap Bridgewater for Carr, and Carr, who's much more durable, who's never had a devastating injury up until this point. And I think the Vikings would be one of the contenders in the NFC. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you. You put Derek Carr on there, you give him weapons like Stephon Diggs, Adam Thielen, and then Justin Jefferson down the road, and he's cooking, man. You will get into this in one of your other what-ifs, but he was cooking in 2016. So, I mean, the Vikings could have been a Super Bowl contending team at that point with Derek Carr at the helm, and I think by that time Thielen's emerged and Diggs has emerged, and so they definitely could have been a really good offensive team with a pretty solid defense to match, and Derek Carr would have been a great candidate there.
And the defense is the big difference maker because the Vikings, when they were under Mike Zimmer, they had a top 5 defense 5 times between now and 2014. This past year, they struggled on defense, but before that was their calling card. And Derek Carr's never had the benefit of playing with even a top 15 defense, so you put him on that team. Again, those same weapons, Dalvin Cook, Justin Jefferson, Stephon Diggs, Adam Thielen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like that's a pretty formidable team in a pretty good division. Of course, you have Aaron Rodgers, but aside from that, you're not really worried about Chicago. You're not really worried about Detroit over that time. So who knows? But I think that's an interesting what if for him, especially because he goes to a team that has organizational stability, good ownership, stability at coaches. Mike Zimmer was around for quite a while, I think 7 or 8 years. So it would have been a nice change for him and his career.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think out of the 3 teams we talked about, I think the Vikings is probably the most ideal scenario for him.
For sure. And I think some folks talked about the Texans looking at him, but they just didn't want to go back to the Carr family after what happened.
I mean, that's kind of stupid. David Carr was what he was, but part of it was, the Texans' fault. They surrounded him with a pretty shitty offensive line, and dude gets sacked 90 times in one season. No quarterback's going to come survive that, especially a young quarterback.
I think they were over the name and all the bad juju that surrounded it. But for sure, if he would have been drafted by the Vikings, his career would have looked very differently. We wouldn't have to worry about him playing in the cold and all that, where people, that's an overrated stat, I think, in my opinion. But he would have played in the dome and all that. So anyway, the next what if is a personal low for me and one that still hurts to this day, and that is, what if Derek Carr does not break his ankle in the 2016 season? So the year is 2016. All is well in Raider Nation. Despite a couple losses to the Kansas City Chiefs, the Raiders are in pole position to win the AFC West for the first time in about 15 years, and I believe they had already clinched the playoffs at this point. Khalil Mack is just getting started on his Hall of Fame career. Amari Cooper is running down the sideline. Michael Crabtree is making toe-tap catches in the back of the end zone. And Derek Carr is in the midst of an MVP campaign. He has weapons to turn to at every position, and the defense is opportunistic and exciting, if not totally elite. But since the Raiders fans can't have good things, it all comes crashing down in Week 16 against the Indianapolis Colts. About 4 minutes into the fourth quarter, Derek Carr drops back, and he gets taken down by his ankle, and the ankle is broken. He gets carted off the field, and I remember just the overwhelming sense of dread that I got watching that play. Do you remember that play? Did you happen to be watching that game?
I wasn't watching that game, but I do remember seeing the highlight, and I was like, my goodness, that's brutal. That was brutal. Like, after that, I was just like, man, Raiders don't have a chance in the playoffs, because who's the next guy up? Matt McGloin or something like that? That's the next guy up. And so it's like, damn, and Carr was having a great season that year. So that was just really, that was probably as painful to you as maybe the Tuck rule.
Definitely more painful because it was more recent.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I love that 2016 team. But so basically what happens is the Raiders, they beat the Colts that day, and then the next week they go into Denver, and if they win the AFC West. They would have been 13-3. They would have gotten the number 2 seed, and they would have got a bye. And instead, of course, they go into Denver with Matt McGloin. They lose that game. They go to Houston as the wild card team with Connor Cook as the starter, and he has not played an NFL game since. So it's pretty clear that they didn't have a chance. They put up a fight, of course, but they were just so hamstrung by the lack of quarterback play. So in my what-if scenario, my dream scenario is, of course, Carr stays healthy. They go in, they beat a Denver team that was pretty mediocre. I think they were 6-10 or 7-9 or something. And at the bare minimum, they would have hosted a playoff game. They would have gotten a bye during the wild card week. They would have hosted a playoff game, probably played the Steelers, who were okay at this time, but they generally beat the Steelers in Oakland. And then they would have gone on to face the eventual Super Bowl champion Patriots in New England. So I'll stop there. Do you think they would have had a chance in New England with, of course, Derek Carr and their full-strength team?
Yeah, that would have been tough going back to New England. I think it becomes the AFC Championship game, right? If in your scenario,
that's right.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, Carr was playing elite that 2016 season. That's probably the best season of Carr's career. I think when the season was done, he was even voted as like one of the top 15 players in the league. But when the NFL did that top 100 list, and so the stats from that season were amazing. And I think definitely Derek Carr gives you a chance, and you saw this is the Super Bowl where the Patriots end up winning, where the Patriots win and they end up playing the Falcons, right? This is the same.
That's correct.
Yep. So you saw what Matt Ryan and Kyle Shanahan were able to kind of do. They slowed down a little bit and lost that Super Bowl, but I think the Raiders could have done something very similar in terms of shredding up that Patriots defense. But again, going into New England, it's a scary thing, especially in January. So. Definitely I agree with you. I think they would have at least made it to the AFC Championship game. And then, you have a 50-50 chance to make the Super Bowl there. Like, it's not like definitely New England dominates and wins that game, but it's a 50-50 shot at the Super Bowl.
Exactly. At least gives them like a puncher's chance. Because, again, those playmakers that we mentioned, Amari Cooper, Michael Crabtree, and then on defense, they weren't elite, but they were opportunistic. Khalil Mack was on that team, of course, at his best. That was a season where he was voted All-Pro at 2 positions. You had guys like Bruce Irvin, Reggie Nelson, Sean Smith. So they had guys that could make a difference. Again, it's not like they would have been favored going into New England, but at the very least, it gives them a puncher's chance. And, of course, none of that happened because of the ankle break. So that one hurts, man.
Brutal.
It still hurts.
That was a brutal one for sure. Yeah, that's definitely a a brutal one. And then Matt McGloin gets hurt, right? And you had to play Connor Cook. Like, you might might have had a chance against the Texans if McGloin was healthy, but Connor Cook, like, I think he was a rookie, right? And he out of Michigan State, has no experience, and he was
awful. Yeah. It was that simple. But yeah, McGloin, I would have given us maybe a chance with him, but he, I believe, hurt his ankle, wasn't 100%. And a guy like that, if he's not 100%, then what good is that? I remember watching that game, seeing it happen, and then I went out to dinner later that night, and I had no appetite. I was just like pushing the food around the plate.
Yeah, it's
staring off into space.
It's tough. Those like late season injuries are tough, right? Early in the season, like when I remember when Jimmy Garoppolo tore his ACL, I was like, oh man. Well, now we know what the season is gonna be, right? Like, at least you're not like sweating it like at the end of the season. You're like, damn, we had a great season. The guy just lost it, right? But yeah, it's tough, man. It's tough, yeah, for sure. I think, I mean, at a minimum, I think the Raiders are going to the AFC Championship, if not the Super Bowl.
At the very, very least. So, all right, we'll move on to the next what if, and this is kind of we said 3, but this is kind of a dual parter. But the first is basically, what if John Gruden was still the head coach? We know all about the emails and everything like that, but we'll go back and we'll paint the picture. So, after the 2017 season, where Jack Del Rio, the Raiders fell short of expectations, Mark Davis, who had a massive man crush on John Gruden, rolls out the red carpet for Gruden and gives him an insane 10-year, $100 million contract to coach the Raiders in Oakland and, of course, in their move to Las Vegas. So that Gruden era started off horribly. He gutted the roster. He trades guys like Khalil Mack and Amari Cooper, and more on that later. And they go 4-12 in 2018. But you start to see them trending up the next couple years. 19-20, they're middle of the road, 7-9, 8-8, and they're okay. But they build a really good offense at the very least. They have a top 10 offense under Gruden. And then, of course, 2021 begins, and the Raiders are 3-1, and we're cruising. I'm hyped. I'm excited for the season. I'm worried, of course, about the Gruden second half collapses, which seem to be happening a couple times over the past few years, and was kind of a trend in his career. But at least things felt good. And then, of course, the emails come out. The emails come out on Monday Night Football, where I believe it was the Ravens and the Colts. The emails dropped during them, and it's pretty bad stuff. I can say a lot of racist and homophobic emails. I don't remember if they all came out at one time or if they were kind of dropped like breadcrumbs. But do you remember that moment when those emails dropped and the reaction to what came out?
Yeah, 100%, man. I remember hearing like once on that Monday night, like, oh, emails leaked with John Gruden making racist remarks and homophobic remarks, and I was like, damn, that's it. John Gruden's out. Like, they have no other choice, right? And in today's world, any hint of that in the NFL, and they're gonna come down hard on you, especially for a guy like John Gruden, who, who's been, who's probably said some things in the past, but not like racist or homophobic. But they were just like, you know what, this is it. We got to just get this guy out of here. And I mean, Mark Davis had to act pretty swiftly, and he did, and that was the only outcome possible here for Gruden. He didn't even have a chance to save face based on once those emails started. Like once the actual emails, people started seeing the actual emails themselves. He didn't even have a chance to save face.
And I think they tried to save face. He came out with a little bit of a pretty weak excuse and some explanation for what he said. And he ended up coaching one more game, and they lost to an awful Chicago team that they probably would have beat, if those emails hadn't have dropped. And they lost to them at home as well. But I think the big what if here is, I think you can draw a pretty clear line between if John Gruden is still the head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders. So regardless, I think of what would have happened last season, I think he would have still been the coach because of the 10-year contract and all that. Mm-hmm. And I think if he is still the head coach, then I think Derek Carr is still the Raiders quarterback next year. I think that's a pretty clear thing that you can point out. I think
that's pretty fair. Yeah, that's pretty fair. I mean, and if John Gruden stays, like you said, the offense was kind of humming along. They were playing pretty well. Carr has some weapons here, and they traded for Devontae Adams the next year. So maybe Gruden gets a lot more out of that combo than, Josh McDaniels did, because I feel like Josh McDaniels is a terrible choice, but that's probably your next what if. But that was like to your point, right? If Gruden's still here, he's probably getting a lot out of this offense, and this offense is playing a lot better. And Carr is, definitely a Raider for a few more years.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's a pretty clear outcome, because that season the Raiders would, of course, go on to make the playoffs for the first time in 5 years. They lose to the eventual AFC champion Cincinnati Bengals in Cincinnati. So I think that's probably a fitting end for that team. And I mean, the fact that he was able Carr was able to lead that team to the playoffs despite the Gruden emails, the Henry Ruggs incident, which could be a what if, but we'll stick to football and on the field stuff.
Yes.
It's pretty gruesome if we go down that road, so we won't do that. But basically, the fact that Carr was improving every year under that Gruden offense, you can see his numbers climbing, his confidence climbing, and then if you're able to keep him in an offense that he's comfortable in and bring in Devontae Adams, like you said, they probably still trade for him because he was really dead set on coming to Las Vegas. I think that would have given John Gruden and Mike Mayock at least another season to make up for their draft mistakes. Maybe they learned lessons from some of the reaches that they had in the draft. And I think it's possible that Derek Carr ends up finishing his career in Las Vegas if Gruden was still a coach. I think they would have been stuck at the hip for a few years.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, for sure.
So the last one I had, again, it's kind of a two-parter because it's part of the John Gruden situation, but it's just a simple question of, what if the Raiders don't trade away Khalil Mack and Amari Cooper? And I think the biggest impact that came from trading those guys wasn't so much the trades themselves, but the ensuing moves that the Raiders made to make up for the mistakes of trading those guys away. So, I mean, Khalil Mack gets traded away in 2018. The following draft, Gruden reaches for Clelin Ferrell in the search for a dominant pass rusher instead of grabbing a, linebacker or another positional need. And the bigger one was the search for a number one wide receiver. So, of course, he trades away Amari Cooper, and he makes a series of moves in order to find a number one wide receiver. He trades for Martavis Bryant, who doesn't do anything in in Oakland. And then, of course, he trades for Antonio Brown, who, the less said about him, the better. But that situation blows up in his face. And basically, I think the lesson that comes from this is you need to hold on to your best players. Stop trading away your best players, especially guys that you drafted. It's not like the NBA where you get the bird rights and all that stuff. But, you can see a world where Khalil Mack is still a Raider. He's lined up with Max Crosby. That's a pretty good foundation for a defense. And then for whatever you can say about Amari Cooper and his attitude and things like that, or his mentality where people think he's kind of soft because he doesn't say much and he's just showing any emotion. But I think him and Carr had a great relationship. And Cooper actually came out and said that Derek Carr was his favorite teammate ever in a podcast recently. So I think if you keep those guys, I think that gives you these foundational players to be able to build on, and then you have a much better team, and everything ensuing after that, kind of the dominoes fall. So what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you. And how much of that decision to trade these guys was Mayock versus Gruden? I wasn't following that close, but I know. They
so
both
the two guys,
let's trade them, but
so Reggie McKenzie was still the GM at the time. So those moves were both in 2018.
Okay.
McKenzie was still there. So I think McKenzie tried to dodge some of the accountability around the Khalil Mack trade, but it seemed like for the most part it was a John Gruden move, or both of them were John Gruden moves.
Yeah, I mean, I never got why they traded Khalil Mack away. I know he was going to get paid, but you pay a guy like that, and he's still in his prime. You drafted him. He's in his prime. He's one of the most dominant pass rushers in the NFL at that time, and you trade him away for a couple of first-round draft picks. That was kind of dumb. And then I guess Cooper, I mean, I'm more 50-50 on Cooper, but yeah, him and Carr had a pretty strong connection, and the moves you made afterwards, it's like, man, you were better off definitely keeping Amari Cooper, right? Versus like going through that headache of Antonio Brown in training camp and doing all kinds of stupid shit, and you just end up like letting him go to like Tampa Bay later. So, I mean, it was just a nightmare, right? The things that happened afterwards, and then they kind of course corrected that here when they traded for Devontae Adams, but you could have probably had Cooper and Adams on the same team right now.
Absolutely.
Right? And that
why not?
That would have been lethal. That would have been deadly for Derek Carr, right? And so yeah, I agree with you. Like Cooper for sure, and Mac, man, you just keep those guys, pay them, you figure it out. All these NFL teams have to deal with similar things, and that's where drafting, right, comes into play. Draft better guys, and don't draft like Colin Farrell with the 4th overall pick when he's looks like a bust.
I like that you called him Colin Farrell because that's
what's his name? I didn't know.
Cleveland.
I didn't even know what Cleveland. Okay, my bad. Cleveland Farrell.
But he deserves to be called Colin Farrell because he's
man,
been
you could probably
awful.
plug in Colin Farrell. He would have been better. Like you probably picked up Colin Farrell off the street and plugged him in. So, but yeah, I mean that's where you got to draft better. You got to have better, make use of your draft picks, especially in the later rounds. Find gems, guys like that, and that's what that allows you to pay your stars, right?
Exactly, and I think the 2 points that you made about those two moves were on point, right? The Khalil Mack one, you do not trade a guy like that. That's like Houston trading away J.J. Watt at his prime, or the Rams trading away Aaron Donald. Like you draft a guy like that, you are blessed to have him after years and years of draft busts at the top of the draft and guys that flamed out. You pick a guy like that. Doesn't get into any trouble, is an elite teammate, elite player. You pay him whatever he wants, and that's
Exactly.
And you can talk about the reasons for why Gruden traded him, but there's no excuse for it. You can talk about, he people say, he didn't want to be here. The guy just wanted to be paid. He wanted to be respected, and that's that. And earlier in that offseason, Derek Carr, they say he signed the biggest contract by a quarterback. It was for about 5 minutes before Jimmy Garoppolo signed a bigger deal and Matt Stafford signed a bigger deal. So as the cap goes up, people are going to sign the biggest contracts in a quarterback's history, but it's not going to last long. Anyway, he actually took a pay cut. He took less money, kind of like less than max money, in order for the team to be able to re-sign Khalil Mack. But instead, they trade him away. They don't respect what they have, and it leads to a number of moves. But the move itself is inexcusable. The thing is, with Cooper, you can understand the reasoning. You're like, okay, this guy maybe doesn't want to be here because he's unhappy. He doesn't like a rebuild, so let's get a first-round pick for him. That was excusable, but it was the subsequent moves after that really tanked the team, where you're making stupid trades and overpaying for Antonio Brown and him not even ever playing a single snap for the Raiders. And it was a series of moves by John Gruden that tanked the career of Derek Carr, held back the Raiders, and it's not a Derek Carr specific what if, but it's one that I wanted to talk about because I think it had a big impact on his career and the way things have played out.
Yeah, for sure. And who did they draft with those Khalil Mack picks? I don't even know who they drafted with those picks that they got in return for Khalil Mack. Was Henry Ruggs one of those picks?
No, it was not Henry Ruggs. It was either Josh Jacobs or Jonathan Abram, because they had those 2 late picks, or two late first-round picks.
I think Abrams was one of them for sure. I can't remember.
I think it was Abram, but regardless of whether, they probably still could have gotten Josh Jacobs with the Amari Cooper pick, which is great because he's been great. But the Jonathan Abram pick was a bust, and then there was a couple other late-round picks, and they ended up paying some other guys that didn't deserve the money. So it's just a whole thing. It's another thing that there's the dominoes that fall, and the butterfly effect of that move.
Yeah, and it's kind of like what the Niners did when they traded DeForest Buckner and then they tried to replace him with Kinlaw. Like I think that's what the Raiders' mindset was, like, oh, we'll trade Cooper and we'll try to replace him and get either Antonio Brown or Martavius Bryant or draft a Henry Ruggs, and one of those guys will replace Cooper, but neither one of them can do it. And maybe Ruggs
but the difference is, the Niners had Nick Bosa and Eric Armstead. They had other dominant defensive linemen. Okay.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, we got 3 all-pro defensive linemen. Let's get rid of one, and because we can't pay all 3 of them. But the Raiders did not have that. So I think it's a organizational issue that we've seen with the Raiders and the way that they've drafted, the way that they've signed guys, and just the total lack of, what's the word I'm looking for? It's just a complete lack of competence. Just the incompetence that was on display in the draft room, in the coaching choices they made, the coordinators. Everything's just kind of a domino effect that you can see that, one guy is not good enough to overcome all of that. Maybe if you're an all-time great, maybe if you're a Pat Mahomes, Tom Brady, etc. But we've seen even those guys, they can't overcome if there's enough issues around them. Pat Mahomes his offensive line couldn't hold up in the Super Bowl. They fell apart. Tom Brady this year, his defense was so-so, and he had no offensive line. They didn't do anything. They got blown out in the wild card. So we've seen that even the greats, not to say that Derek Carr is one of the all-time greats, but even the greats need help. And going down this list of what-ifs and thinking about all the things that could have gone differently for him really makes you think about how important situation is for a quarterback and the impact that it can be. Like, you can be a slightly above average quarterback and look like a superstar because you have an incredible team around you. We've seen guys like Kirk Cousins do that. We've seen guys like Jimmy Garoppolo make a Super Bowl because they had a great team around them. And I think that's the one thing that's been lacking in Derek Carr's career. So, yeah.
Absolutely right. And you just saw the Niners do it here with Brock Purdy. So they made a 7th round draft pick, Mr. Irrelevant, look like a pretty elite quarterback here with the team around him. And so, like you said, right, if you give Carr the weapons, you get Carr the team around him, we're talking about a much different career. We're talking about a much different story here. We're talking about Derek Carr, lifelong Raider, best quarterback since Rich Gannon type of deal. I mean, he still is the best quarterback the Raiders ever had since Rich Gannon. But, yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate. And then, the Raiders made it worse. They bring in Josh McDaniels, who, for lack of a better word, seems like a moron. They're just amplifying the mistakes, and then they're like, "Oh, well, we're choose McDaniels over Carr," and it's just really dumb. But that's where the Raiders are now.
That's where we're
back to square one. Yeah, back to square one.
All right, so in a couple weeks we'll know what team he's on. But if you could predict a team that he ends up on, as of February 3rd, name 2 teams that you think he could realistically end up on?
I would say the Colts and the Texans. Those are probably the 2 I think realistically make sense for Carr. With I think the Colts probably being the more ideal fit for him. They have a guy in Michael Pittman Jr. They have Jonathan Taylor at running back. They have a pretty stout defense, pretty decent offensive line. So if you really want to see Derek Carr succeed, I would think Colts makes a lot of sense. Texans, a little bit more of a rebuild, but, they've shown their defense is decent. They have some playmakers in Brendan Cooks. So, maybe they decide, DeMeco Ryans decides, hey, you know what, I'm not going in for a rebuild. I'm going to try and get into the playoffs, and I'm going to make a trade for Carr. But I would say, for me, I would think ideally the best scenario for Derek Carr is the Indianapolis Colts.
Okay. Yeah, I'll go on record. I will say either the Saints or the Jets. Okay. I think he wanted a team with stability at head coach, and he gets that. Dennis Allen is staying on in New Orleans. They have some cap issues, but they do have talent. They got Chris Olave and Alvin Kamara, and they have a really good defense. And then, of course, the Jets, very similar situation. They have a great head coach, great defense, and they have plenty of weapons, Breece Hall, Garrett Wilson, etc. So I think either of those teams would be a good fit. It's just a matter of
it's
where
crazy
he wants
how
to
many,
go.
Yeah, it's crazy how many teams could use a quarterback like Derek Carr.
Exactly. That's the irony of all this, man. It's I don't think he's going to get traded. I think because they have to. There's a deadline of February 13th. I guess we'll find out, but that's when his contract becomes guaranteed for next year. So I think it's more than likely that he gets released and is able to sign somewhere because he also has a no trade clause. So again, just the Raiders kind of messing something up again. They gave this guy a no trade clause even though they wanted to trade. It was just a whole thing. It's just more organizational incompetence. But wherever he goes, I'll be rooting for him.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Another dark horse team that just came to mind to me was the Washington Commanders. I could see them moving on from Wentz. Poor Wentz and getting passed around.
Oh, he's done.
But he's done. But I mean, I could see the Commanders being a dark horse team in the Carr race.
For sure, I think they're one of the leaders in the odds of where he ends up next year.
Oh, really?
I don't know if he'll want to go deal with that ownership situation if he has the choice to choose that.
That's true.
But yeah, I mean, either way, of course, always be a Raiders fan, but always be grateful for what Derek Carr brought to this team, and I'll be rooting for him wherever he goes, of course, unless he is playing against the Raiders. So that's it for our show today. We appreciate your time. Thank you guys for taking this self-indulgent journey for this lifelong Raiders fan as a kind of a tribute, I guess, to Derek Carr and the good memories. I know there's been a lot of bad ones too, but there's plenty of good ones along the way. So thank you for checking us out. Please make sure to follow us on all the social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at 4040 Vision Pod. And make sure to download, like, and subscribe to our podcasts on all the major podcasting platforms. Thanks, Sulman. Appreciate you, man.
Yep. Later, man.
Peace out.